We're starting a new sefer, a new book of the 5 books of Moses, the Chumash. That's how it has its name, Chumash, because it's from 5, Chamesh. And the first book, being Genesis, was the story of creation and the story of the formation of a family that becomes this tribe that gets Hashem's blessing, and Hashem entrusts this tribe, this Bnei Israel, the children of Yaakov who become the Bnei Israel, with a duty and with a purpose, and that is to maintain a relationship with him and hold to some God consciousness in their ways, in their worldliness. That was the task given to Abraham, and then Abraham needed to see which of his children could continue that path, and he was kind of checking out Esau or Yaakov, who would be the best candidate to represent godliness in the world. And it turns out that not Esau, but yes, not Yishmael, but yes, Yitzchak. And then Yitzchak, having this kind of spiritual inheritance to pass onto someone who's going to kind of continue the line, and he's looking, yes, Esav, yes, Yaakov, no Esav, no Yaakov, and then Rivka intervenes and Yaakov passes this baton of responsibility for holding a certain consciousness into the world, gets passed not to Esav but to Yaakov. And then Yaakov has to struggle with the fact that he was chosen, or he got the blessing, his brother didn't get it. We have that whole struggle with the angel. And then he goes to Lavan, and while he's with Lavan, he's very challenged to keep his integrity, to keep his identity and his path straight. And Lavan is trying to trick him all the time, but he survives. He comes back and he meets his brother, and then he's trying to settle down, and he has his 12 sons, and there's 12 tribes, and then we get the whole Joseph story. And as it fulfills a prophecy that was given to Abraham, that his descendants would need to go down into Egypt and be foreigners in a foreign country. So because of the famine, the brothers end up going to Egypt to get food. And we had the whole interaction between Yosef and his brothers, and Yosef testing to see if his brothers are truly sorry for the way they treated him. And the brothers set up a test whereby the brothers have to either stand up for Benjamin or really sell him out with their own safety primary. And thank God they passed the test and they stand up for Benjamin. And then they live happily in Egypt for a while until we come to this week's Parsha. And this week's Parsha is really we actually said last week, or even the week before, when it said that Pharaoh had his two dreams. One of the Meforshim said, and thus began the exile, with those dreams of Paro. But really, we didn't feel that it was an exile right away. In fact, Yaakov has his 17 best years of his whole life living in Egypt. And the question can be asked, and in fact, one of the grandsons of one of the Lubavitcher Rebbes, I think it was the Tzemach Tzedek, who was the third Lubavitcher Rebbe, he asked his grandfather, who was the Alter Rebbe, Reb Shneir Zalman of Liadi, how is it possible that Yaakov had his best years in Egypt, this place of, such deprivation and idol worship and a culture so antithetical to a Torah worldview? How could he have his best years there? His 17 years were considered his best years. And the answer was given that when you are living your purpose, even in environment that's antithetical to that purpose, and you're overcoming the challenges that are in that environment, and you're living your highest purpose, then you're actualizing your being and your identity in a very special way. And that can be the highest accomplishment. So even though the place of Egypt was antithetical to Torah, wasn't a godly place, it was in fact quite the opposite, Yaakov and his sons managed to live in their alcove in Goshen. The boys, the sons, they weren't boys, they were men, but they were shepherds, and they managed to live their life in semi-isolation, and they kept their identity, they kept their customs. Hi, Shoshana, welcome. They kept their identity, they kept their customs, they kept their God consciousness intact. And in a way, that's sort of the purpose of our life, is to manifest our God consciousness in the world, even when the world isn't necessarily so hospitable to that, but you overcome that challenge and you're able to turn the avoda, the act of transformation. So there's the transformation of the galus is, hi Susan, nice to see you. So the action, and we saw that Joseph had two sons. He had one son, Menashe, which was sort of about Joseph managing to get over the betrayal of his family and live in Egypt. He got married and he had a son. But then when he names his second son Ephraim, which has got the root of the word perus, fruit, that he turned his exile into a situation of fruitfulness, that's actually the higher path, not just surviving in Galut, but really thriving in Galut. And Ephraim represents that. So when Yaakov wants to bless, even though Menashe is the eldest son, when he puts his right hand on Ephraim's head first, Joseph says, you know, Tati, you've got them mixed up. And Yaakov says, no, Ephraim is really the one who's going to be more powerful. His descendants are going to be more spiritually powerful. But the Hasidus learning on that is that Ephraim represents this transformation of Galus, not just handling Galus, but transforming it in a way, so to speak. But we know that even though that was happening on some little level when Yaakov was living with his sons in Goshen, we know from everything that we're going to learn in this next book starting today called SHMOT, that in fact that period of time where Yaakov's sons lived in harmony and managed to stay true to their own belief system, that didn't go on for so long. And what happened, we know that Joseph passes away, and I haven't found a source to explain why Joseph actually passes away earlier than his brothers, but it says Joseph passes away and then only his brothers pass away. Could be because he was living a more stressful life. He was dealing with all the elites and always being a person connected to Torah and mitzvahs in the middle of Egyptian society and managing, you know, feeding the whole world and devising strategies to keep everyone fed, and a lot of high stress, high profile job. And his brothers were shepherds and learning Torah in Goshen. So he passed away before they did. But when we come into this book of SHMOT, we're going to start looking at the dynamics of how a people could lose autonomy. It's actually very crucial and relevant and timely conversation for the times we're living in now. When one thinks about what is freedom and what is autonomy and what is an exile, and how do we lose our freedom, and how does freedom get taken away from us. So it's very interesting to look at Egypt and the story of Egypt and the story of the exile in Egypt, because we've been taught that Egyptism is a prototype for all the exiles that occur in Jewish history, or at least all the exiles that, that occur in Jewish history. And we know that there were 4 main exiles. There was Egypt being the first. The second one was Babel, Babylonia. Then there was Persia. And then the final exile is the exile of Rome. And Rome is Edom. And Edom is the nation that we can say spiritually we're still in that exile of Edom now, which is the Western world, Christianity, Western civilization. There are opinions that there's a 5th exile, which is the exile under Ishmael, which would be the oppression under the Arab countries, because Ishmael's descendants are the Arabs. And we sort of negotiating that as well. But classically, we talk about the 4 exiles. Whether we say 4 exiles or 5 exiles, Egypt is the one that's most carefully, it's the one in Chumash, and the details of it are written in great detail, and not only the details of how they got into a state of exile, but how they got out of a state of exile. So it's really interesting to look at it and to try and apply it to our personal experience and to what's going on today. Because as we know, if we learn Chumash and even celebrate the Jewish holidays like Purim or Hanukkah or any of these holidays, and we just think that we're celebrating something that happened in the past, so we're not really doing it in the right way. In fact, if we listen to the Megillah on Purim, and it says halachically, according to Jewish law, if you listen to it backwards, you haven't fulfilled your obligation. What does it mean to listen to it backwards? So the sages tell us listening to it backwards means you think it's just a story that happened in the past. And you're not connecting to the fact that within yourself, you have a Mordechai and an Esther and a king Achashverosh, and you have to find all those characters within yourself and experience Purim as your own victory over all the forces that are trying to squelch Yiddishkeit for Purim story and Hanukkah story. And so the same way, when we read this story of Exodus of Egypt, and of course we know this for Pesach, when we go through the Haggadah, if we're just reading it about it happened to the Jews way back then, and we're not looking at, oh my gosh, am I in exile? And how did I get into exile? And how do I get out of exile? So that's by way of introduction. So, L'chaim, L'chaim. Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam she'hakol niyeh bivaro. So what is exile exactly? How would we define exile? So exile is a loss of autonomy. If I talk to you, and I told you last week that I was starting to learn from the Ramchal, he's a Kabbalist, Moshe Chaim Luzzatto, and he has a whole book. He wrote many books that are sort of foundational studies on Jewish philosophy and Kabbalistic thinking, and sort of, when I say Kabbalistic thinking, I mean looking into the deeper truths underneath the stories. When he defines exile, he really talks about it going back all the way to Adam and Chava, that Adam and Chava were living in a world, and the Ramchal, that's Moshe Chaim Luzzatto, they abbreviate his name and call him the Ramchal. He talks about it almost in a very interesting metaphor, that there's doors and windows through which God's light shines into the world. And when we're not in a state of exile, the doors are wide open and Hashem's light can shine down into our world. And because Hashem's light is shining down into our world, we have a consciousness that can appreciate godliness, because imagine the room is very light and illuminated. The light is on very brightly because the doors are wide open and it's a really sunny day outside. So we have a lot of light, a lot of God awareness. And not only that, but everything is flourishing. There's fruit that's abundant. The trees are abundant. People have abundant health. Everything is flourishing and abundant because there's all this shefa. Shefa, and I said this last week, shefa, I end a lot of my yoga classes with hold your hands up and receive shefa. Shefa is God's blessing pouring down into the world. So when we're not in exile, the doors to all this shefa pour down in abundance. When we're in a state of exile, instead of big open doors to allow the shefa to come in, we have windows. And the windows might be smaller and they're not always open so wide. But of course, there's still shefa coming down. Otherwise, we couldn't sustain ourselves. But we're living in a much more less clear world. The light is less clear. It's kind of dulled down. And because of that, we have less conscious ability to appreciate godliness. And we don't thrive and our health doesn't thrive. And we get into tussles and fights with each other. And we're victim of jealousy and fear and all these kind of low vibrational emotions. And I sent Susan a little picture of frequencies of vibrations when you're vibrating on a higher frequency. So then you're exuding love and faith and trust and harmony and all those high vibrational feelings. And when you're feeling fearful and anxious and you feel the resources are limited and you have to fight with other people to get the resources, then your vibration gets heavier and you become more dense and your vibration slows down. So the first exile was when Adam and Chava did their sin by eating from the tree in the Garden of Eden that they weren't supposed to. And suddenly those beautiful lights, those big doors that were open to Gan Eden, they closed. And the windows stayed open, but the light was much less. And so we know that Adam and Chava changed from being light bodies, high frequency beings, even operating on an otherworldly dimension, became much more dense. And they had to leave this ethereal, more high consciousness state, and they go out of the garden. And then since then, we're trying to get back into this illuminated, high vibrational, high frequency vibrational state, which is also giving us access to God consciousness in a very expanded way. So we come out of the Garden of Eden, we're trying to form this family. Avram has a connection with God. He gives this the blessing of how to sustain this connection. He gives it to his son Yitzchak. Yitzchak nourishes it and he gives it to his son Yaakov. Yaakov somehow has access to it and he gives it to all of his kids, and they hold on to this consciousness. But then when we start with this week's Parsha, what happens is that it starts getting diminished. And we'll read really how it gets diminished when we read this week's Parsha. Because what happens is that Paro doesn't like it that these Jews have a consciousness that's different to the consciousness of Egypt. And it's kind of eerie, and it should be very informative to us how these dynamics are playing out in our world today. Paro's world and the energy of Egypt is one of tremendous sophistication. They were a very evolved society. They had a lot of occult sciences. They believed in pagans. They did a lot of pagan worship. I'm sorry. They had a lot of pagan rituals and rites. They had magic. They had occult. They had all kinds of things that were not in sync with monotheistic thinking. And Paro didn't like this. And God blessed the Jewish people that while they were there in Goshen, they were multiplying in a very prolific fashion. They were becoming more and more numerous. And what I read in today while I was preparing for the Shir, that what Paro didn't like actually is he didn't like the fact that they represented monotheism. I'll just read it for you because this became more clear to me when I was preparing for the class. Paro wanted to persecute the Jews for the simple sake of doing so. Now, I always learned it that he saw them becoming numerous and he was worried that in an event of a war, the Jewish people would side with the enemies and fight the Egyptians, and there was some practical reason why he was becoming so anti-Semitic, for want of a better phrase. So in this Gutnik Chumash, and Susan always likes to know where I'm taking my sources from. So this is the Rebbe's Chumash, the Gutnik, the Kohos Chumash, not the Gutnik Chumash. It says here, Paro wanted to persecute the Jews for the simple sake of doing so. He hated what the Jews represented, and he was concerned that Jewish monotheism might prevail over Egyptian paganism. So in addition to plotting how to decrease the Jews' physical numbers and diminish their power, he devised a plan to sink them into Egyptian culture and make them forget their heritage. Now this is really intense because of the world we're living in right now, because of the censorship, because of the increasing limitations to our freedom, because of the fact that we're living in a time where government seems to have an agenda, or some forces that are out there seem to have an agenda to get more and more people to think in a similar way, and diversity of opinions are getting more and more pushed out and not tolerated. So he consulted with his advisors, and this is really interesting to know. So Paro consulted with his 3 advisors. Who were they? Advisor number 1 was Bilam, and we know who Bilam was. He's the guy who tried to curse the Jews, but he was a prophet. He had this rather peculiar relationship with his donkey, tried to hit the donkey. That's Bilam. That was one of Paro's advisors. Second advisor was Yitro, who became Moshe's father-in-law. He was a priest from Midian who had experienced every kind of idol worship that there was to experience. And the third advisor was Eov. And we know about Eov because that's Job. We know about Eov because he had tremendous suffering in his life. And he was an advisor to Paro. So Bilam came up with the plan of increasing oppression so that the Jews' birthright would lower. And Yitro advised against this plan and therefore had to run away from the court. And he then went back to Midian where he stayed, and that's where Moshe found him later. And Eov was undecided, but he didn't speak up against this plan. Anyway, that's really the underlying reason of why Paro decided to start oppressing the Jews. And he gave them back-breaking labor, increasing and increasing. But it's really interesting. It didn't actually start off with Paro oppressing them so quickly. We learn that there were different periods of this oppression, that it came in stages. And the stages are that first, that there was a first stage, and in the first stage, things weren't that bad. Paro asked for volunteers to come help him in some building projects. There's even a medrash that says Paro wore a brick around his neck. And when any of the people, particularly the Jews, kind of were complaining, that say, you complaining, but Paro himself, he came with a shovel and he came with a pick, and he looks like he's all ready to help. And so slowly, through initially volunteering to the work and then trying to please Paro and showing that they can be such hard workers, till eventually getting enslaved. So if we look at the name of this parsha and the name of the whole book, the name of this second book in the series of 5 books of the Bible, 5 books of Moses, 5 books of the Chumash, it's called SHMOT or Shmos, which means names. And I was actually having a conversation with Shoshana yesterday about names, and if they kept their names or they didn't keep their names, or what's the significance of names. So first of all, names is the name of the whole book. So the first book is Genesis or Bereshit, in the beginning. But the second book is, in English, it's called Names, and in Hebrew, it's called Shemot, names. So it starts off and it says that these are the names of the sons of Israel who came to Egypt. So I said I would share my screen, and I have it already here, sharing the screen. Where is it? Here it is. You can look at it on the screen. So it says, and these are the names of the sons of Israel who came to Egypt with Jacob. Each man and his household came. And then it says to us all the names, Reuven, Shimon, Levi, Yehuda. I was practicing this song with my grandson. Reuben, Shimon, Levi, Yehuda, Issachar, Zebulun, and Benjamin, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, and Asher. These are the tribes of Israel. So it says they all came down with Yaakov, 70 souls, and Joseph, who was already in Egypt. Now, if we look at the Rashi, it says, although Hashem counted them in their lifetime by their names, he counts them again after their death to let us know how precious they are to him, because they are likened to the stars, which he takes out and brings in, and he calls them each by name. Okay, so let's just talk a little bit about names for a minute. So this aspect about names, the word for essence, a person's essence, the etzem, it's actually interesting in yoga or in movement, or just in terms of one's physical body, one's bones are called etzemot. That's what our bones are. It's the structure of our essence is our etzemot. If I would ask you, what's the significance of a name? Like if you want to unmute yourself, or I can unmute you all and just ask you for a second if anyone wants to comment on what's the significance of a name. If you're called by your name, do you identify with your name? Do you have a feeling about your name? When people don't go by their Hebrew names, sometimes if we have Shabbatons, we make a big fuss and say, let's call you by your Hebrew name. There's something about a name. I don't know if anybody wants to say anything.
I have something to say.
Okay, sure. Go.
I'm waving my hand. I'm so excited, teacher.
Well, I can't because you don't put it on, but yes.
When someone is in a coma, the most, what's the word, efficacious? Yeah, probably that's the word. Way to wake them up is to actually say their name. It's somehow, I guess, encoded somewhere, in the body and in the mind, and it's it works. I mean, when you can't stir someone, it's been known that people start getting a little fluttery or whatever, and language of course, but the name is the essence of the individual, and Jewishly, so much is put into that you could probably write reams about that.
Right. Okay, thank you. Anyone else have a feeling about names?
Just the word essence. That's the word that comes up.
Yeah, so it's a person's essence. Okay, so thank you. So
I have a good question. What about a person who wanted to change their name? Like, let's say they were named something but their parents, and then they changed it.
So if you weren't given a Hebrew name, for example, you can take on a Hebrew name, and you can take it on and start using it. I don't even know if you have to do a specific, you can have a name in shul, but you don't have to. If you start using it, it becomes your name. And if you don't like your name, or you want to add on a name, or you want to change a name, there are ways to do it. You can go to a rabbi. People who ill add on a name. People who feel like their name hasn't brought them good mazel, which is another way of saying luck, but I don't like to say luck. They can change their name. So there is something about that. Okay.
I don't know, Bracha,
Yes.
if I ever told you that at my Tanoim in the old city with Reb Shlomo, he was doing our Tanoim, and he said, Shoshana Bat, and he looked at my mother and asked her Jewish name. She said, I don't have a Jewish name. He went to a Shlomo place, right? He came back down and he said, how do you like Liba? She said, I love it. And she became Liba.
Wow.
Okay.
Well, I think you can't just, I mean, if you want it to be official, you actually have to have someone say it in a shul.
I asked the Shiloh about it, and
gave me my name, and I didn't go to any shul. We were talking on the phone. I was going to Israel. Big Rav. We decided on a name, and I didn't go to no shul. But anyway, let me carry on.
Well, I guess there are different answers depending upon whom one asks, because I also asked the Shiloh, and that's the answer I was given.
Right, that's the beauty. 70 faces.
All right.
Right.
Okay, so talking about this essence of the name, and like Shoshana said, that if a person is fainting, we can call them back by their name. And it says actually a beautiful thing that a person's, I wrote it down, I just want to, the name is a channel through which one's existence and spiritual life actually flows into the body. Now, this is an amazing thing, but it shouldn't be so surprising in a way, because we know that Adam walked around Gan Eden and he gave each thing a name that corresponded to its essence. So, for example, a stone, the word for stone in Hebrew is an even. Aleph, base, or vase, nun, even, which means that the energy of the stone is sort of transported to the stone through those letters that resonate in a certain way. And when they put together with the Aleph first, and then the vase, and then the nun, that is the essence of a thing. So the name of a thing is its essence. So for a Jewish person, the name is the channel through which the existence and spiritual life flows into that body. So coming back to the names that we're talking about, the Jewish people came into Egypt. One of the things is that even though they were working really hard, even though they were losing their awareness of God because they were working so hard, because they got swallowed up into this material reality of Egypt, even though, and the harder they worked, the less bandwidth or headspace they had for God consciousness. That's exactly where the exile starts to happen. It gets darker and darker in their own head, their own awareness. It gets more and more and more and more constricted. They're working harder and harder. They become like little hamsters on the wheel, running in the pursuit of whatever. So that becomes the exile. So in their defense, they didn't change their names. Hashem considers, and the value of a name, reflecting to that Rashi, is Hashem considers each one of us unique and precious. We all have our own name. And even if other people use that name or we named after other people, it's still part of our uniqueness. And the fact that for them, they didn't have that much that was Jewish. They had their language, they had their names. I think they even maybe had their Jewish dress. But I also didn't know this until I was studying today. I did actually. They didn't keep bris milah anymore. That's why when they went out, there was such a thing. They had to get a bris because they couldn't eat from the Korban Pesach without a bris. And then we have that whole idea of spilling of blood. And then they had to take the sheep and do an offering with the sheep and put the blood of the sheep on the lintel. But it wasn't only the sheep's blood that got them the ticket out. It was also the blood of the bris milah. So this essence of this name is connected, and the whole point of the Egyptian exile, why they needed to go into this exile, apparently was so that they could reveal their essence in this oppression. So when you squeezed, a little bit like an olive, that's why they often use the image of an olive. When you squeeze through oppression, through difficulty, then your oil comes out. So the Jewish people are experiencing this constriction of freedom and autonomy in Egypt. They get squeezed. Somehow their essence gets revealed. It's like a crucible that they get formed into a nation. The impurities are kind of burned out of them. They form into a nation, and somehow there's something about this process that enabled them to deserve to get the Torah once they came out. But we're just getting into the exile. We're not getting out yet. We're going to have to experience this exile for quite a few weeks before we come out. So let's look at let's look a little bit more about this. So the purpose of the Torah is to bring divine consciousness into the most mundane aspects of reality, even those aspects that appear to be antithetical. And the theme of this book, and the theme of the story, and the theme of the Jewish people holding on to their names, i.e. their essence, is that no matter how hard it seems, we must not give up the struggle to maintain divine consciousness. The opposing forces might be mighty, but we have the power to overcome them. And self-sacrifice reveals the essence of our soul. By revealing our soul and fulfilling its unique mission, we help to usher in the redemption. So now, talking about self-sacrifice, I want to start talking about two women who were real heroines, and then give a little chassidus on that story of the heroines, and then we'll wrap up. So who were the heroines? So the heroines were the midwives. So let's just find the story about the midwives, and we can look at it. So just before we get to the midwives, last year we spoke about how the women took their mirrors. We've spoken about it many times. The women took their mirrors to their men who were working, and that was incredible. Mesirat Nefesh. I just want you, I'm going to share the screen again, and I want to find the story of the midwives, because it's a beautiful story. So let's see. No, it's not there. Here. Yeah, so let's read this together now. Let's show Rashi. So it says, so the king of Egypt summoned the midwives and said to them, and said to them, why have you done this thing? Oh, so let's go a little bit back because it's at the end of, it's at the end. Let's go back here. Here. So they embittered the lives of the Yidden with hard labor. Let me bring back Rashi. I'm sorry, I'm just trying to work here with my Rashi and my screen. So I'm coming back here. Pasuk 15, Tesvav. Now the king of Egypt spoke to the Hebrew midwives, one who was named Shifra and the second who was named Pua. So Rashi tells us a little bit about this, but who was Shifra really? Shifra was Yocheved. Who's Yocheved? Yocheved was Moshe's mother. And who was Pua? Pua was Miriam. That's Moshe's sister. And then he said to them, when you deliver the Hebrew woman and you see on the birth stool, if it's a son, you should put him to death, but if it's a daughter, she may live. But it says here, but the midwives, however, feared Hashem, so they did not do as the king of Egypt had spoken to them, but they enabled the boys to live. Okay, so that's very nice. That's an act of civil disobedience. It's really the first act, honestly, of civil disobedience that we see in the Torah, that these two women refused to do what Paro wanted them to do, which is very brave. It's very brave and shows great courage. And the idea that the more that we oppress, the more we squeezed, we redeem ourselves through this self-sacrifice. So according to our sages, Miriam and Yael, according to our sages, Miriam was just 4 or 5 years old. And she and her mother decide that they're not going to cooperate with Paro, and they tell him, you know, these Hebrew women, they're so quick at giving birth that before the babies are even born, they don't even need us, we can't help them. Before we even come, the baby's already born, so, you know, we can't really do we can't really participate really in your genocidal plan. Just by the way, this year by abortion, I saw a statistic of how many babies were killed in abortion this past year. It's really a very dramatic number. I don't remember the number, but quite scary how high the number was. So, so we know that Miriam and Yocheved get very special rewards from them standing up to Moshe, standing up to Paro, and it's a beautiful story about resistance in the face of oppression. But I just want to give you another dimension to it from a Hasidic perspective that I was reading, and it's really beautiful. So it says, birth is the process whereby something fully developed, yet hidden, is brought into revelation. Spiritual birth occurs when we understand something new about Hashem, and the emotional response born of this understanding is allowed to be revealed, to flower and to flourish. So first of all, I just want to say that we've had different kind of exile. Sometimes an exile, I see Susan has a question, I'll answer it in a minute. Sometimes exile has a component that it's a physical oppression, and sometimes the exile has a spiritual oppression. Apparently, the oppression of Egypt, although they were physically oppressed and they had to work very hard, what was distinctive about the oppression is that they didn't have space in their head for God consciousness. So it was really an oppression of the consciousness. It was an exile of consciousness. We've had other oppressions where it's been an exile of the heart. In fact, I read a beautiful Perush, and I can't remember now which rabbi said it, but now we have an exile of the heart, which is our emotions. We're jealous, we angry, we fearful, we insecure, we love the wrong people, we have inappropriate relationships. It's an exile of emotions, our emotions. But we all know God exists, or many people know that God exists, but it's really about our emotions. That's where we're caught in exile. And particularly in our life today, we can see the role of fear and lack of trust, and the whole Corona story, how that plays into fear and trust issues, which are huge right now. But in Egypt, it was about consciousness, not having a space for God in the consciousness. And actually, when it says later on in the Psukim, when they cried out to God and God heard their cry, well, I already explained this last week, God always is listening. It means that they understood that God was listening. God's always listening, but they opened something in their consciousness to cry out to God. So let's look back to these midwives. So it says, just as a physical birth process is assisted by midwives, there's also a spiritual birth where we need to give birth to the correct emotions. And to do that, we need spiritual midwives to help us birth the correct emotions. And what are the correct emotions? The correct emotions are love and fear of God, not love and fear of anything else. Not love for material objects, life, food, clothing, shelter, people, prestige, money, or even health, but the love and fear of God. And we need spiritual midwives. Now, listen to this. It's such a beautiful piece of Chassidus, and it's just incredible. We channel our emotional capacity into real emotions by thinking and talking about whatever we want to get emotional about. If we think and talk about Hashem, we'll come to love and fear Him. If we think and talk and focus on the material things, we will have a fear or a love for those things. Listen to this. Here's the crux. Thinking and speaking are thus the two spiritual midwives that enable us to express our innate emotional capacity the way that we choose. I thought that was really beautiful, that thinking and speaking are the spiritual midwives. So this is the last paragraph, and then I'll open to questions. Pharaoh therefore thought to prevent the birth of this God consciousness. He was the king of Egypt, the earthly personification of its evil. He spoke to Shifra and Puah, the experience of delight and the power of speech. And he asked them, don't focus on divinity. Don't facilitate the birth of these holy emotions. Let them stay focused on materiality. Keep them entrenched in the material consciousness. And they said, what can we do? Their essence comes through and we can't help them. They need to give birth to what they're giving birth to. So I thought that was really beautiful. So anyway, I'm going to open to questions. So questions, comments, anything you would like to say.
Well, I don't know if you, first of all, the reason I raised my hand is I wanted you to repeat a line, but it was so long ago, I wouldn't be able to tell you which line it was. It was a lot of deep, powerful words, and it was too fast, but I got the essence. And I just find it fascinating that you use the term resistance in the face of oppression, knowing that, do you know what was going on in the news the last 4 hours?
Yes.
Okay. With the times of Parsha in what's going on in the world.
Yes. I just want to say, I didn't say before that the midwives talked about the Ivrim, that they were Hebrew midwives, because the idea of being Hebrew is that you're drawing from the other side. It says Abraham lived on the other side of the river, Aver Hayarden, and Ivrim is that as these midwives, they're drawing down the intellect from this other level, so yeah, I just wanted to say that. And the idea of Mitzrayim is constriction. Everything about Mitzrayim is constriction of this godly consciousness. So getting out of Egypt would be the liberation out of that constriction. And just to say that, the Lubavitcher Rebbe asked everybody to have in mind 12 Pesukim every day, to have them and have children repeat them every day. And one of those 12 Pesukim is to think every single day that you're coming out of Egypt, each and every day, to believe that we come out of Egypt again and again and again. We're always coming out of Egypt. But anyway, I'm still listening for other questions or comments. Any other questions or comments? But if they are, they are, and if they aren't, they aren't. We didn't, I could just read the Hayom Yom. I usually read it in the beginning, but I'm going to read it at the end, which actually I think is very fitting for today, which is the 23rd of Tavis, and I think it'll be interesting what your take is on this Hayom Yom. It says, groaning by itself won't do a bit of good.
What's the word?
Groaning.
With a G?
Yeah, groaning, but you could say moaning also. A groan is only a key to open the heart and eyes, so as not to sit there with folded arms, but to plan orderly work and activity, each person wherever he can be effective, to campaign for bolstering Torah, spreading Torah and the observance of mitzvot. One person might do this through his writing, another with his oratory, and another with his wealth. So I think that's interesting, because I'm always asking, like, what am I supposed to do in the midst of these crazy times? What's my role? What am I supposed to do? Am I supposed to march? Am I supposed to publicize, information online that maybe people aren't reading in other channels? What's my role? So the Rebbe says, teach Torah. That's the goal. But I'm interested if anybody else has any other takes.
I actually do have a question about women and giving birth, because as I've been dealing with infertility, and there are a lot of other women who are going through this at this time. So is there any take from like the rabbis or anywhere else? Like, why is that? Like, why is it so much harder now for some women to get pregnant as opposed to maybe 50 years ago, when people got married earlier and maybe like the environment was cleaner and people were just getting pregnant without problems? Oh, and another question is, like, when I was reading, like in Yom Kippur services, there is like when we do the when